The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Diana Spencer walked through the corridors that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. 23 years old, recently married to the heir to the British throne, she carried herself with the grace expected of a princess. Yet her blue eyes held a sadness that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Charles had left early that morning for another official engagement, barely acknowledging her presence at breakfast. Their marriage, now 6 months old, had already settled into a pattern of polite distance and formal exchanges. Diana touched the sapphire necklace at her throat, a wedding gift from the Queen Mother, its weight both comforting and suffocating. The necklace was magnificent, a cascade of Ceylon sapphires surrounded by diamonds, each stone carefully selected to complement the famous sapphire engagement ring that had once belonged to Charles's mother. But to Diana, it felt like a beautiful chain, binding her to a life she was still learning to navigate. Margaret Thornton, Diana's lady-in-waiting and one of the few people she trusted completely, found her standing by the window in the morning room. Margaret was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a practical nature that had served the royal household for over 2 decades. She had watched Diana struggle through the early months of her marriage with growing concern. "Your Royal Highness, you have the children's hospital visit this afternoon," Margaret reminded gently, noting the distant look in Diana's eyes. "The car will be ready at 2 o'clock. Diana turned, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course. Thank you, Margaret." She paused, her fingers unconsciously moving to the necklace again. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" Margaret studied the young princess carefully. In all her years of service, she had learned when to speak and when to listen. "Your Highness, may I speak frankly?" "Please do. You're one of few people who can. I believe that sometimes we must grow into the lives we're given. Your compassion and natural warmth are already making a difference. Yesterday's letters from the literacy program you visited last week speak volumes about your impact." Diana walked to the ornate desk where, indeed, dozens of handwritten thank you notes from children were carefully arranged. Their innocent words of gratitude brought the first genuine smile to her face that morning. "They're so honest, aren't they? No pretense, no protocol. Just real feelings. That's why they respond to you so naturally, Your Highness. You see them as individuals, not just part of a royal duty." Before Diana could respond, a sharp knock interrupted their conversation. James Whitmore, Charles's private secretary, entered with his usual air of importance. James was a man in his 40s, impeccably dressed, who had served the Prince of Wales for nearly 8 years, and took pride in managing every detail of Charles's life with military precision. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid there's been a change to this afternoon's schedule. His Royal Highness requires your presence at a meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury. The children's hospital visit will need to be postponed." Diana felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. Another last-minute change, another instance of her own commitments being deemed less important. "James, those children have been preparing for this visit for weeks. Can't the meeting with the Archbishop be rescheduled instead?" James's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was an unmistakable hint of condescension in his tone. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Your Highness. The Archbishop's schedule is quite demanding, and this particular meeting concerns matters of significant importance to the Prince of Wales. And my commitments are not of significant importance." Diana's voice carried a slight edge that made Margaret step closer, ready to intervene if necessary. "Of course they are, Your Highness, but surely you understand the hierarchy of obligations within the royal household." The word hierarchy hung in the air like a physical weight. Diana felt the familiar sensation of being diminished, of her role being reduced to that of a supporting player in someone else's story. She looked down at the children's letters on her desk, their colorful drawings and heartfelt words a stark contrast to the cold formality of royal protocol. "Very well," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "Please arrange for the hospital visit to be rescheduled at the earliest possible opportunity. And James, in the future, I would appreciate being consulted before my engagements are canceled." James bowed slightly. Of course, Your Highness. The car will be ready at 1:30 to take you to meet His Royal Highness. After James left, the room felt charged with unspoken tension. Margaret approached Diana, who stood with her back to the room, staring out at the gardens. Your Highness, perhaps we could arrange a private visit to the hospital tomorrow morning? Sometimes informal visits can be even more meaningful. Diana turned, grateful for Margaret's understanding. That's a wonderful idea, but let's not tell James until after it's done. I'm tired of having every gesture analyzed and approved by committee. Margaret nodded, recognizing the growing assertiveness in Diana's voice. Over the months, she had watched the shy kindergarten teacher transform into someone learning to navigate the complexities of royal life, though not without significant personal cost. An hour later, Diana sat in the back of the royal car, watching London pass by through tinted windows. The necklace felt heavier than usual against her skin, its clasp catching occasionally on the high collar of her blue wool dress. She found herself thinking about her life before marriage, when decisions were simpler and authenticity wasn't a luxury she couldn't afford. The meeting with the Archbishop took place in Charles's private study at Clarence House. When Diana arrived, she found Charles already deep in conversation with the elderly cleric about environmental preservation initiatives. Charles barely glanced up when she entered, offering only a brief nod of acknowledgement. Ah, Diana, excellent timing, Charles said, though his tone suggested her presence was more obligation than pleasure. The Archbishop and I were just discussing the theological implications of environmental stewardship. Diana took her seat, noting how naturally Charles commanded the room, his passion for environmental causes evident in every gesture. This was the Charles she had fallen in love with, the man who could speak eloquently about saving ancient forests and protecting wildlife. But lately, that passion seemed reserved only for his causes, not for her. The Archbishop, a gentle man with wise eyes, seemed to sense the undercurrent of tension between the royal couple. Your Royal Highness, he addressed Diana, I understand you've been doing remarkable work with literacy programs and children's charities. Such work requires great compassion and dedication. Diana felt a warmth at the recognition. Thank you, Your Grace. Working with children has always felt natural to me. They're so honest about their needs and grateful for genuine attention. Indeed, the Archbishop nodded. Christ himself said we must become like children to enter the kingdom of heaven. There's much wisdom to be gained from their simplicity and trust. Charles shifted in his chair, clearly eager to return to his environmental discussion. Yes, well, Diana has always had a way with children. Now, about the reforestation project. The dismissal was subtle, but unmistakable. Diana felt herself becoming invisible again, a decorative addition to Charles's real work. She sat quietly for the remainder of the meeting, her hands folded in her lap, the sapphire necklace suddenly, feeling like it was restricting her breathing. As they prepared to leave, the Archbishop approached Diana privately. Your Royal Highness, might I suggest that your work with children is perhaps more important than you realize? Sometimes the greatest service comes not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of human connection. Diana looked into his kind eyes and felt tears threatening. Thank you for saying that, Your Grace. Sometimes I wonder if I'm making any real difference at all. Oh, my dear, I believe you're making more difference than you know. The heart that seeks to serve others is never wasted, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. The drive back to Kensington Palace was conducted in silence. Charles sat beside her, reviewing papers for his next appointment, while Diana stared out the window at people going about their ordinary lives. She envied them their simplicity, their freedom to make choices based on personal preference rather than royal protocol. That evening, Diana found herself alone in her private sitting room, having declined Charles's invitation to join him for dinner with visiting foreign dignitaries. She needed solitude to process the day's events and the growing sense of isolation that seemed to deepen with each passing week. Margaret brought her a light dinner on a tray, noting Diana's thoughtful mood. Your Highness, the Children's Hospital confirmed that tomorrow morning would work perfectly for an informal visit. The children are quite excited. Diana smiled genuinely for the first time all day. Thank you for arranging that. Sometimes I think those visits are more therapeutic for me than for the children. Perhaps that's exactly as it should be, Margaret said wisely. Service that comes from need, rather than duty, tends to be more authentic. After Margaret left, Diana stood before her mirror, slowly removing the sapphire necklace. In the lamplight, the gems caught fire, beautiful and cold simultaneously. She held it in her hands, feeling its substantial weight, and realized it had become a metaphor for her entire existence. Beautiful, valuable, and increasingly burdensome. She thought about the Archbishop's words about children's simplicity and trust. Tomorrow, at the hospital, she would be able to connect with that simplicity again, to remember who she had been before titles and protocol had redefined her identity. Diana placed the necklace carefully in its velvet-lined box, noting how the absence of its weight immediately made her feel lighter. Perhaps tomorrow, she would wear something simpler, something that felt more like her true self. As she prepared for bed, Diana reflected on the strange duality of her existence. By day, she was the Princess of Wales, expected to embody grace, duty, and royal dignity. But in quiet moments like these, she was still Diana Spencer, a young woman trying to find her place in a world that seemed determined to reshape her into something she wasn't sure she wanted to become. The irony wasn't lost on her that her greatest comfort came from encounters with children, people even more powerless than herself in the grand scheme of royal life. Yet their honest reactions and unconditional acceptance reminded her that authentic connection was still possible, even within the constraints of her elevated position. Outside her window, London continued its ancient rhythm, millions of people living lives of their own choosing. Diana envied them that freedom, even as she accepted the responsibility that had come with her marriage. But perhaps, she thought as sleep finally came, there might be ways to honor both her duty and her authentic self. The sapphire necklace rested in its box, catching moonlight from the window, beautiful and patient, waiting for the next time it would be called upon to play its part in the ongoing drama of royal life. But for now, Diana slept without its weight, dreaming of simpler times and wondering if she might find a way to bridge the growing gap between who she was expected to be and who she truly was. The morning light filtered through the hospital windows as Diana walked down the pediatric ward, her steps lighter than they had been in weeks. She had chosen a simple cream-colored dress and pearl earrings instead of the elaborate sapphire necklace, feeling more like herself than she had since her wedding day. The children's faces lit up as she approached, their genuine excitement a stark contrast to the studied politeness she encountered in most royal settings. 8-year-old Sarah, recovering from heart surgery, clutched a handmade card with crayons scattered around her bed. "Princess Diana, I made this for you." Sarah held up a drawing of a figure in a blue dress with yellow hair, surrounded by rainbow hearts. Diana knelt beside the bed, accepting the artwork with genuine delight. "This is absolutely beautiful, Sarah. Is this me in the drawing?" "Yes. And those are all the hearts of the children who love you," Sarah explained with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children possess. For a moment, Diana felt tears threaten. In this simple drawing, she saw herself reflected not as a royal obligation or a political symbol, but as someone who mattered to another human being. "Thank you, darling. This means more to me than you could possibly know." Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the hospital's chief pediatrician, watched the interaction with professional interest. She had worked with many royal visitors over the years, but Diana's approach was notably different. There was no performative quality to her attention. She seemed genuinely present with each child. "Your Royal Highness, would you like to visit our premature baby unit?" Dr. Morrison asked. "We have several infants there whose parents could use some encouragement." Diana followed the doctor down a quieter corridor to a room filled with tiny incubators, each containing a baby so small they seemed almost ethereal. The sight took Diana's breath away. She had always loved children, but seeing these fragile lives fighting for each day brought out a protectiveness she hadn't known she possessed. This is little Thomas, Dr. Morrison explained, stopping beside an incubator containing a baby weighing barely 2 pounds. He was born at 26 weeks. His parents, Janet and Michael, have been here every day for 6 weeks. Diana met Janet, a young woman who looked exhausted, but maintained a vigil beside her son's incubator. Her clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in hospital chairs, and her eyes held the particular strain of a mother watching her child fight for life. "How are you holding up, Janet?" Diana asked, her voice soft with genuine concern. Janet looked surprised by the personal question. "Some days are better than others, Your Highness. The doctors say Thomas is a fighter, but it's so hard watching him struggle through tubes and machines." Diana studied the tiny baby, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance. Something about his fragility reminded her of her own vulnerability, hidden beneath royal protocol and public expectations. "He's beautiful. You can see strength in his little face. Would you like to touch him?" Dr. Morrison asked. Premature babies often respond well to gentle human contact. Diana carefully placed her hand inside the incubator, letting her finger rest against Thomas's tiny palm. Immediately, the baby's fingers wrapped around hers with surprising strength. The simple human connection sent an unexpected jolt through Diana's heart. "He likes you," Janet said, smiling for the first time since Diana's arrival. "Look how he's holding on." Diana felt something shift inside her as she maintained the gentle contact with Thomas. Here was pure human need, uncomplicated by politics or protocol. This tiny being didn't care about her title or her marriage difficulties. He simply responded to kindness and human warmth. "Janet, how long have you been able to stay here with him?" Diana asked, still maintaining contact with the baby. "The hospital has been wonderful about letting us stay, but Michael had to go back to work last week. We're struggling a bit financially, and the travel costs from our home add up." Diana made a mental note, already formulating plans to help without creating a bureaucratic spectacle. "Dr. Morrison, is there a family support fund here at the hospital?" "We do have some resources, but they're always stretched thin," the doctor replied. After spending another hour with the children, Diana returned to Kensington Palace feeling more purposeful than she had in months. The contrast between the hospital's authentic human connections and the palace's formal atmosphere struck her immediately. Charles was in his study when she arrived, surrounded by environmental reports and correspondence. He looked up briefly as she entered. "How was the hospital visit?" he asked, though his tone suggested polite obligation rather than genuine interest. "Transformative," Diana said, sitting across from his desk. "Charles, I met a family with a premature baby. They're struggling financially while their son fights for his life. I'd like to help them." Charles set down his papers, giving her his attention for the first time in days. "Diana, you know we can't simply hand out money to individuals. There are proper channels for charitable assistance. I'm not talking about handing out money. I'm talking about using our position to make a real difference in specific lives. Isn't that what our role should be about? Our role is about serving the crown and supporting the institutions that serve the people," Charles replied, his tone taking on a lecturing quality that Diana had come to dread. Individual cases, no matter how compelling, can't become personal causes without proper consideration. Diana felt the familiar frustration rising. "But, Charles, these aren't just cases. They're real people with real needs. That little boy I held today doesn't care about institutional protocols. He just needs help." "Diana, you're being naive. We can't save everyone, and attempting to do so would undermine the systematic approach that actually creates lasting change." The word naive stung. Diana stood, her composure carefully maintained despite the anger building inside her. "Perhaps what you call naive, I call human. There's a difference between systematic change and systematic indifference." Charles's expression hardened. "That's unfair, Diana. My environmental work has the potential to impact millions of lives across generations. Your hospital visits, while admirable, are essentially symbolic." "Symbolic?" Diana's voice rose slightly. "That baby's grip on my finger wasn't symbolic, Charles. His mother's exhaustion isn't symbolic. Their fear isn't symbolic. Of course not, but our response must be proportionate and sustainable. We can't become personally involved in every tragic situation we encounter. Diana realized they were talking about fundamentally different approaches to their royal duties. For Charles, effective service meant large-scale initiatives and institutional change. For her, it meant human connection and individual impact. Neither approach was wrong, but they seemed increasingly incompatible within their marriage. That evening, Diana attended a formal dinner for visiting Japanese diplomats. She wore the sapphire necklace again, its weight familiar, but more noticeable after her day of freedom. The conversation flowed around topics of trade agreements and cultural exchange, topics that felt abstract after a morning with Thomas and the other children. Lady Sarah Pemberton, a longtime family friend, noticed Diana's subdued mood during cocktails before dinner. "Diana, you seem thoughtful tonight. How are you adjusting to married life?" Diana touched the sapphire necklace unconsciously. "It's an adjustment, certainly. Some days I feel like I'm living someone else's life. That's not uncommon for new brides, especially in your circumstances. The key is finding ways to make the role your own. But what if the role doesn't allow for that? What if authenticity and duty are fundamentally incompatible?" Lady Sarah studied Diana carefully. She had known the Spencer family for decades and had watched Diana transform from a shy girl into the poised young woman standing before her. "Diana, may I share something I learned during my own difficult periods? Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is simply being genuinely ourselves, regardless of the expectations surrounding us. But what if being myself disappoints everyone who depends on me, fulfilling their version of what I should be? Then perhaps their expectations need adjustment rather than your authentic self needing suppression." The conversation was interrupted by the call to dinner, but Lady Sarah's words stayed with Diana throughout the elaborate meal. She found herself observing Charles as he engaged enthusiastically with the Japanese ambassador about sustainable development initiatives. His passion was genuine and admirable, but she realized that his vision of their shared future seemed to leave little room for her own emerging sense of purpose. After the dinner, Diana retreated to her private sitting room to review correspondence from her various charitable commitments. Among the formal thank you letters and requests for patronage, she found a note from Dr. Morrison at the hospital. The note explained that Thomas had taken a turn for the better after Diana's visit, showing improved vitals and responding more actively to stimulation. Janet had asked Dr. Morrison to convey her gratitude for the time Diana had spent with him, noting that it had given her hope during a particularly difficult period. Diana set the letter down, feeling a profound sense of validation. Her presence had made a measurable difference in that family's experience, not through grand gestures or institutional programs, but through simple human connection and attention. She thought about Charles's dismissal of her hospital work as essentially symbolic. Perhaps he was right that symbolic gestures couldn't solve systemic problems, but what he failed to understand was that for the individuals involved, those symbols represented hope, recognition, and human dignity. Margaret knocked softly and entered with tea service. "Your Highness, forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to let you know that the Family Support Fund at the Children's Hospital received an anonymous donation today sufficient to cover travel and accommodation costs for families like Thomas's parents." Diana looked up, surprised. An anonymous donation? How wonderful for them. Margaret's slight smile suggested she might have suspicions about the donor's identity. "Indeed, Your Highness. Sometimes the most meaningful gifts are those given without expectation of recognition." After Margaret left, Diana sat alone with her thoughts, absently fingering the sapphire necklace. The day had crystallized something important for her. She was beginning to understand what kind of princess she wanted to be, even if that vision didn't align perfectly with what others expected. The necklace, beautiful as it was, represented everything external about her new life, the symbols and appearances that mattered so much to others. But her work with the children represented something internal and authentic, a way of serving that felt genuine to who she was as a person. Diana realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue trying to mold herself into Charles's vision of an ideal royal wife, or she could begin carving out space for her own approach to service and duty. The choice wasn't without risks. Asserting her own vision might create tension within her marriage and the royal household. But thinking about Thomas's tiny grip on her finger, about Sarah's rainbow hearts, about Janet's grateful tears, Diana felt something she hadn't experienced since her wedding day, a sense of purpose that belonged entirely to her. She carefully removed the sapphire necklace and held it in her hands, studying its intricate beauty. Tomorrow, she would wear it again, playing her role in the ongoing performance of royal life. But she was beginning to understand that the most important part of her service might happen not when she was wearing symbols of her position, but when she was simply being herself. The balance between duty and authenticity wouldn't be easy to maintain, but Diana was beginning to believe it might be possible. The children had shown her that her natural instincts for compassion and connection had value, even in a world obsessed with protocol and propriety. As she prepared for bed, Diana felt something she hadn't experienced in months: excitement about her future. Not because it would be easy, but because she was beginning to see a path forward that honored both her responsibilities and her authentic self. The sapphire necklace rested in its box, patient and beautiful, ready to resume its role tomorrow. But Diana was beginning to understand that while she might wear the symbols of her position, she didn't have to let those symbols define the entirety of her service or her identity. 3 months had passed since Diana's transformative visit to the Children's Hospital, and the changes in her approach to royal duties had become increasingly apparent to those who knew her well. She had developed a routine of visiting hospitals, homeless shelters, and community centers, often with minimal advance notice and always with genuine engagement that surprised staff and beneficiaries alike. On a gray Tuesday morning in November, Diana sat in her private study reviewing requests for patronage when Margaret entered with an expression of concern. "Your Highness, James Whitmore is here to see you. He says it's urgent and concerns your recent charitable activities." Diana set down her pen, instinctively touching the simple pearl necklace she had chosen that morning instead of the elaborate sapphire piece. "Send him in, Margaret." James entered with his characteristic air of importance, carrying a leather folder that Diana suspected contained documentation of her recent activities. His expression was more serious than usual. "Your Royal Highness, I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your recent approach to charitable work." "What concerns?" Diana asked, though she suspected she knew what was coming. "The palace has received inquiries from several organizations about your unscheduled visits. The AIDS hospice visit last week, for instance, was conducted without proper security protocols or media coordination." Diana felt her defenses rise. The AIDS hospice visit had been one of her most meaningful experiences. She had spent hours with patients who were often isolated from their families, listening to their stories, and simply offering human companionship during their final weeks of life. "The visit was perfectly safe, James. I notified security and went with minimal staff deliberately. Those patients don't need a media circus during their final days. Your Royal Highness, with respect, that's not for you to determine unilaterally. These decisions affect palace security, media relations, and the careful balance we maintain with various charitable organizations." Careful balance. Diana's voice carried an edge that made James straighten in his chair. "James, I held the hand of a 25-year-old man dying of AIDS while his own family refuses to visit him. I don't think careful balance was what he needed. Your compassion is admirable, Your Royal Highness, but you must understand that your actions have broader implications." The media coverage of that visit sparked controversy about royal involvement in politically sensitive health issues. Diana stood and walked to the window overlooking the gardens. Since when is caring for the dying considered political? Since the public health policies surrounding AIDS became a matter of government debate, Your Royal Highness. Your presence implies royal approval of specific approaches to managing the crisis. My presence implies human decency, nothing more. James opened his folder and pulled out several newspaper clippings. The headlines suggest otherwise. Diana defies protocol for AIDS victims. Princess embraces controversial cause. Royal rebel challenges conservative health policy. Diana turned back to face him, her expression calm, but her eyes flashing with determination. Are you telling me I should avoid helping dying people because it might generate unflattering headlines? I'm telling you that His Royal Highness and the palace are concerned about the direction of your charitable work. There's a perception that you're pursuing personal agenda rather than supporting established royal initiatives. The phrase personal agenda hung in the air like an accusation. Diana felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity that had been building for months. James, when did caring about individual human suffering become a personal agenda rather than a royal duty? When it began to overshadow systematic approaches to addressing social problems, Your Royal Highness. His Royal Highness's environmental initiatives, for instance, address root causes that could benefit millions rather than providing temporary comfort to individuals. Diana recognized Charles's perspective in James's words and realized this conversation had been coordinated. I see. So my approach to service is considered less valuable because it focuses on individuals rather than systems. Not less valuable, Your Royal Highness, but potentially less strategic. The palace believes your natural compassion could be channeled more effectively through established programs with measurable outcomes. Measurable outcomes, Diana repeated slowly. James, how do you measure the value of human dignity? How do you quantify the impact of letting someone know they matter during their darkest hour? James shifted uncomfortably. Your Royal Highness, these are philosophical questions that, while valid, don't address the practical concerns about protocol and public perception. Diana returned to her desk and picked up a letter from her correspondence pile. This is from a mother of a child with cerebral palsy. She writes that my visit to her son's therapy center gave him hope and motivation to work harder in his treatment. How should I measure that outcome, James? Individual success stories are certainly meaningful, Your Royal Highness, but they must be weighed against broader considerations, such as the fact that uncoordinated charitable work can create unrealistic expectations among the public about royal availability and resources. If you visit one AIDS hospice, why not all of them? If you comfort one grieving family, why not every grieving family? Diana set down the letter and looked directly at James. You're right, I can't help everyone. But does that mean I shouldn't help anyone? It means your efforts should be strategic and sustainable rather than reactive and emotional. The word emotional triggered something in Diana. Throughout her marriage, her feelings and instincts have been consistently characterized as emotional rather than intelligent, reactive rather than thoughtful. James, I want you to arrange a meeting with Charles. Not through schedulers, not through staff, but directly with my husband. We need to discuss our different approaches to service. Your Royal Highness, His Royal Highness is currently preparing for the upcoming trade mission to Australia. His schedule is quite demanding. Then, we'll discuss it during the trade mission. I assume wives are expected to accompany their husbands on such important diplomatic ventures. James's expression suggested this wasn't the outcome he had hoped for from their conversation. I'll speak with His Royal Highness about scheduling a discussion. After James left, Diana sat alone, contemplating the confrontation that was clearly brewing. She had spent months trying to find her own voice within the constraints of royal life, and now that voice was being challenged as inappropriate and destabilizing. Margaret returned with tea, noting Diana's thoughtful expression. Difficult conversation, Your Highness? Margaret, do you think I'm being naive about my charitable work? Margaret paused in arranging the tea service, choosing her words carefully. Your Highness, I've served this household for 20 years. I've watched many approaches to royal duty, and I can say with certainty that authentic compassion is never naive, though it may sometimes be inconvenient for those who prefer predictable protocols. But am I being unfair to Charles? His environmental work is genuinely important, and perhaps my individual focus does undermine systematic approaches. May I speak candidly, Your Highness? Always. His Royal Highness's work is indeed valuable, but it serves people at a distance. Your work serves people face to face. Both approaches have merit, but yours requires more courage because it demands genuine emotional engagement. That afternoon, Diana made an unscheduled visit to a women's shelter in East London, accompanied only by a single security officer, Anne Margaret. The shelter housed women escaping domestic violence, many with children, all trying to rebuild their lives from nothing. Maria Santos, the shelter director, greeted Diana with surprise and gratitude. Your Royal Highness, we had no idea you were coming. The women are just finishing lunch. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to see your work here and meet some of the residents if they're comfortable with that. Diana spent 2 hours at the shelter, listening to stories that range from heartbreaking to inspiring. She met Linda, a nurse who had fled an abusive marriage with her 2 young daughters and was slowly rebuilding her confidence while training for a new position. The hardest part isn't starting over, Linda explained as her daughters colored pictures nearby. It's believing you deserve better. When someone like you takes time to listen, it reminds us that we're still people worth caring about. Diana knelt down to admire the daughter's artwork, struck again by children's ability to find joy even in difficult circumstances. These are beautiful drawings. Are these pictures of your new home? 6-year-old Emma nodded enthusiastically. Mummy says we're safe here, and she's learning to help sick people again. I drew her with her nurse uniform. Diana studied the drawing, seeing hope and resilience in crayon strokes. Your mummy must be very brave to take such good care of you while learning new things. She is brave, Emma agreed matter-of-factly. And pretty too, but she cries sometimes when she thinks we're sleeping. The innocent honesty pierced Diana's heart. She looked at Linda, recognizing something familiar in the woman's expression, the weight of trying to be strong while feeling uncertain and alone. Linda, how long have you been here at the shelter? 3 months, Your Highness. Maria and her staff have been incredible, helping me get my nursing credentials updated and providing childcare while I attend classes. Diana turned to Maria. What's your biggest need here? Not for publicity or fundraising, but really, what would make the biggest difference for families like Linda's? Honestly, more transitional housing. We can provide immediate safety and support services, but women need time to rebuild financially before they can afford independent housing. Most have to choose between staying here longer than ideal or leaving before they're truly stable. Diana made mental notes, already considering how she might address the housing need without creating the bureaucratic complications that seem to concern James and Charles so much. That evening, Charles was waiting in their private sitting room when Diana returned to Kensington Palace. His expression was serious, and she noticed he had changed out of his formal day clothes into casual attire, suggesting he intended this to be a personal rather than official conversation. Diana, James told me about your conversation today. I think we need to discuss your charitable activities. Diana removed her coat and sat across from him, noting how the physical distance between them seemed to mirror their growing philosophical differences. I agree. I think we have very different ideas about what our role should be. My concern isn't about your compassion, Diana. It's about the sustainability and appropriateness of your approach. The AIDS hospice visit, for instance, put you in contact with patients whose families have abandoned them precisely because of fear and prejudice about the disease. Exactly why they needed someone to show they still mattered as human beings. But, Diana, by making that visit so public, you've taken a position on a controversial social issue without consulting the palace or considering the broader implications. Diana felt her frustration rising. Charles, I held dying people's hands. I didn't make speeches about government policy or medical research. I simply treated them like human beings worthy of dignity and compassion, which sends a political message whether you intend it or not. Your actions are seen as royal approval or disapproval of how society should respond to AIDS. And you think royal approval of compassion toward dying people is inappropriate. Charles ran a hand through his hair. clearly struggling with how to express his concerns without seeming heartless. I think royal involvement in controversial issues should be carefully considered and coordinated with government policy when appropriate. Diana stood and walked to the window, her back to Charles. When did we become so afraid of controversy that we're willing to let people suffer alone rather than risk criticism? We haven't become afraid, Diana. We become responsible. Our actions have consequences beyond our personal feelings, and we have obligations to consider those broader impacts. Diana turned to face him, and for a moment, Charles was struck by the change in her appearance. The shy girl he had married was gone, replaced by a woman with clear convictions and growing confidence in her own judgment. Charles, what if our obligation is to use our platform to model the compassion and human connection that our subjects need to see from their leaders? What if our obligation is to support institutions and policies that can address root causes rather than providing temporary comfort that doesn't solve underlying problems? They stared at each other across the room, both recognizing that they were discussing more than charitable work. They were defining fundamentally different approaches to leadership, service, and human responsibility. Diana reached up and touched the simple pearl necklace she wore, so different from the elaborate sapphire piece that had become symbolic of everything constraining about her new life. Charles, I understand your perspective, but I can't abandon mine. When I see suffering that I can alleviate through simple human presence and attention, I can't walk away because it might be politically inconvenient. And I can't support an approach that could undermine systematic efforts to address the problems you're trying to alleviate through individual attention. The impasse was clear. Diana realized that this conversation marked a turning point in their marriage. Not because they disagreed, but because their disagreement reflected irreconcilable differences in how they understood their roles and responsibilities. Then, we'll have to find a way to pursue different approaches while maintaining our partnership, Diana said finally. Charles nodded, though his expression suggested skepticism about whether such parallel paths could coexist within their shared public life. That night, Diana lay awake thinking about Linda and her daughters, about the AIDS patients she had visited, about little Thomas in his incubator. Each face represented a choice about what kind of person she wanted to be and what kind of leader she wanted to become. The sapphire necklace lay in its box across the room, beautiful and patient, waiting to resume its role in the ongoing performance of royal duty. But Diana was beginning to understand that the most important parts of her service might require her to step outside that performance entirely, to risk controversy and criticism in order to maintain her connection to her own conscience and to the people who needed her most.